80,000 Roman legionaries massacred in a single day. A mighty river stained crimson with the blood of what would become Rome's greatest military humiliation since Hannibal crossed the Alps. This is the forgotten story of the Battle of Arausio, where pride and division cost an empire everything. Picture this. The year is 105 before Christ. Rome stands as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. Her eagles have conquered from Spain to Greece. Her legions are feared from Britain to Africa. Yet on a blood-soaked plain near the Rhône River in what we now call France, the mighty Roman war machine would suffer a defeat so catastrophic that it nearly brought the Republic to its knees. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. What leads a superpower to repeat the same deadly mistakes of the past? Is arrogance always the prelude to downfall? These aren't just questions about ancient Rome. They echo through every empire, every nation, every leader who has ever tasted power and forgotten the lessons of humility. In 105 before Christ, two mighty consular armies marched north to face the terrifying Cimbri and Teutons. These weren't just barbarian raiders. They were entire migrating nations, hundreds of thousands strong, led by warrior kings Boiorix and Teutobod. Men, women, children, and warriors all moving together like a human tsunami toward the heart of Roman civilization. Rome responded as she always did, with overwhelming force. Two separate armies, commanded by consul Gnaeus Mallius Maximus and proconsul Quintus Servilius Caepio. On paper, it was more than enough to crush any barbarian threat. But here's the twist that makes this story so compelling. The real enemy wasn't waiting on the battlefield. The true destroyer of Roman might was already marching within their own ranks. The poisonous rivalry between their own generals. What you're about to witness is more than just a military disaster. It's a tale of betrayal, blood, and eternal lessons about what happens when ego trumps strategy, when personal ambition destroys collective strength. You'll discover how two proud Roman commanders, who should have been brothers in arms, instead became the architects of their own annihilation. This isn't just ancient history, my friends. This is a mirror held up to every civilization, every organization, every family that has ever torn itself apart from within. The ghosts of Arausio still whisper warnings to anyone willing to listen. Don't miss a single detail of this historic catastrophe. Hit that like button, share this epic tale with a fellow history lover, and subscribe to Imperium Chronicles to dive deep into more legendary episodes from the ancient world. Because the stories of the past aren't just entertainment, they're the roadmap to understanding our present, and maybe, just maybe, avoiding the same fatal mistakes. The legions are about to march into their darkest hour. Are you ready to witness the fall of giants? Before we dive into the bloodbath itself, you need to understand something crucial. These weren't your typical barbarian raiders that Rome was used to swatting away like annoying flies. What was bearing down on the Roman Republic in the 2nd century before Christ was something far more terrifying. Entire nations on the move, driven by desperation, hunger, and the ancient dream of finding their promised land. Picture this. Somewhere in the frozen wastes of northern Europe, beyond the Rhine, beyond the known world, catastrophe struck. Massive floods devastated the Jutland Peninsula, what we now call Denmark. Crops failed year after year. The seas rose and swallowed entire settlements. But nature wasn't the only enemy. Powerful tribes from the east were pushing westward, squeezing these Germanic peoples like a vice. It was move or die, fight or starve. And so began one of history's greatest migrations. Not just warriors, mind you, but entire civilizations packing up everything they owned. Their families, their cattle, their sacred objects, their very way of life, and rolling south like a human avalanche toward the warm, fertile lands they'd heard whispered about in legends. Leading this unstoppable tide were two extraordinary men who would become Rome's worst nightmare. First, there was Boiorix, king of the Cimbri. Don't let the barbarian label fool you. This man was a strategic genius. While Roman generals studied in marble academies, Boiorix had learned warfare in the school of survival. He could read a battlefield like a scholar reads a scroll, anticipating enemy movements, setting traps that would make Hannibal himself nod in approval. The Romans would soon discover that their textbook tactics meant nothing against a mind that had been forged in the crucible of constant warfare. Then there was Teutobod, king of the Teutons, and he was everything Boiorix was, and more, but in the most terrifying way possible. Imagine a leader who could inspire men to charge into certain death with nothing but his voice, whose very presence on the battlefield could turn a retreating rabble into an unstoppable war machine. Teutobod wasn't just charismatic, he was magnetic in that dangerous way that turns ordinary people into fanatics. And brutal. The stories that filtered back to Rome spoke of a man who collected the heads of enemy chieftains like trophies, who could smile while ordering the massacre of entire settlements. Here's what makes this story so tragically ironic. Rome, the master of the known world, looked at this approaching storm and saw exactly what they wanted to see. Disorganized nomads, rabble without discipline, barbarians who would scatter at the first sight of Roman steel and Roman eagles. After all, hadn't they conquered the civilized Greeks? Hadn't they humbled the mighty Carthaginians? What could a bunch of homeless wanderers possibly do against the legions that had conquered the Mediterranean? This was Rome's fatal mistake, and it reveals something profound about human nature. Success breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds blindness. The Romans had become so accustomed to victory that they couldn't imagine defeat. They saw what they expected to see, not what was actually there. They saw hungry refugees where they should have seen desperate warriors with nothing left to lose. And there's nothing more dangerous than a man fighting for his family's survival. But here's a chilling detail that Roman historians tried to bury. These weren't just military expeditions. When the Cimbri and Teutons moved, they brought everything. Their wives, their children, their elderly. This wasn't conquest for glory or gold. This was total war, the kind where defeat meant the extinction of your entire people. Every Cimbrian warrior knew that behind him stood his wife and children. Every Teutonic spearman fought with the knowledge that retreat meant watching his family starve or be enslaved. The Romans were about to face an enemy they had never encountered before. An entire civilization with its back against the wall, led by brilliant commanders who understood that this wasn't just another border skirmish. This was a fight for the right to exist. And Rome, drunk on its own success, completely underestimated what was coming for them. Now here's where our story takes a turn that would be unbelievable if it weren't tragically true. Rome, faced with the greatest barbarian threat since Hannibal, decided to send not one, but 2 armies to deal with the crisis. Sounds smart, right? Double the force? Double the chance of victory? Well, my friends, sometimes 2 is worse than 1, especially when those 2 armies are commanded by men who hate each other more than they hate the enemy. Meet Gnaeus Mallius Maximus, the consul of Rome. Now, Maximus was what the Roman elite loved to call a new man, which was their polite way of saying he was nouveau riche, a commoner who had clawed his way to the top through talent, ambition, and probably a fair amount of luck. He wasn't born in a marble mansion on the Palatine Hill. He didn't have ancestors whose statues lined the Forum. What he had was street smarts, military experience, and the backing of the common people who saw him as one of their own who had made it big. But here's the thing about Roman society. It was more obsessed with bloodlines than a thoroughbred horse breeder. The old aristocratic families, the ones who traced their ancestry back to the founding of Rome, looked at men like Maximus the way a pedigree dog owner looks at a mutt. Sure, he might be consul, sure he might command legions, but he would never truly be one of them. And that burning resentment was about to cost Rome everything. Enter Quintus Servilius Caepio. And oh boy, was this man everything Maximus was not. Caepio was aristocracy incarnate. Old money, old blood, old arrogance. His family had been serving Rome since before most people could remember, and he never let anyone forget it. As proconsul, he commanded what was arguably the better of the 2 armies. Better equipped, better supplied, filled with veterans who respected the old ways and the old names. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. In normal circumstances, the consul would outrank the proconsul. Maximus should have been the supreme commander, with Caepio following his orders. But Caepio looked at this upstart commoner and basically said, "Not a chance in Hades am I taking orders from this nobody." Picture the scene. 2 Roman armies camped within sight of each other, while a massive barbarian horde approaches. Instead of planning their joint attack, instead of coordinating their strategies, these 2 grown men are having what amounts to a deadly tantrum. Caepio refused to meet with Maximus. He wouldn't even acknowledge his authority. When messengers arrived with orders from the new consul, Caepio would literally turn his back and walk away. But here's what makes this even more insane. Caepio didn't just ignore Maximus, he actively sabotaged him. He spread rumors among his troops that Maximus was incompetent, that he was going to get them all killed, that only a true Roman of noble blood could be trusted to lead them to victory. He turned what should have been a unified Roman response into a bitter contest of egos. The Roman Senate back in the capital was getting desperate reports. "The barbarians are coming, our armies won't cooperate, what do we do?" But even they couldn't force these 2 proud commanders to work together. Pride, my friends. Pride was about to accomplish what no barbarian army had managed since Hannibal: the complete destruction of Roman military might. And here's the most tragic part of all. Both armies were magnificent. These weren't raw recruits or hastily assembled militia. These were professional Roman legionaries, the best trained, best disciplined fighting force in the ancient world. United, they would have been unstoppable. The Cimbri and Teutons, dangerous as they were, would have been crushed between 2 coordinated Roman armies like grain between millstones. But divided, they were about to become the ingredients for the greatest military disaster in Roman history. Because while Maximus and Caepio were busy measuring the length of their family trees, Boiorix and Teutobod were planning something that would make the Rhône River run red with Roman blood. The stage was set for catastrophe, and the architects of Rome's destruction weren't barbarian kings. They were Romans themselves. And now we come to the day that would haunt Rome for generations. October 6th, 105 before Christ. The morning mist was rising from the Rhône River, and 2 separate Roman armies were about to march into what can only be described as a masterfully orchestrated slaughter. Here's what makes this battle so absolutely chilling. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a trap so perfectly executed that it reads like a military textbook on how to destroy a superior force. Boiorix and Teutobod had been watching the Romans for weeks, studying their movements, their habits, their fatal flaw, their inability to work together. And these barbarian kings, these supposedly uncivilized savages, were about to give Rome a lesson in strategy that would make Sun Tzu himself applaud. The trap began with what seemed like a gift from the gods. Cimbrian scouts appeared on the horizon, just a few hundred warriors, seemingly caught off guard by the Roman advance. They turned and fled, retreating across the open plains toward the river. To the Romans, it looked like their lucky day. The barbarians were running scared, abandoning the high ground, giving up every tactical advantage. Maximus, desperate to prove himself and claim the glory before Caepio could steal it, ordered his army to pursue. His legions moved forward in perfect formation, their eagle standards glinting in the morning sun, their hobnailed sandals drumming out the rhythm of Roman might. Behind them, Caepio's forces followed, but at a distance, still refusing to coordinate, still playing their deadly game of pride. But as the Romans advanced into that seemingly empty plain, something terrifying was happening around them. Those fleeing Cimbrian warriors, they weren't really fleeing. They were leading the Romans exactly where Boiorix wanted them, into a killing ground that had been prepared with the patience of a spider weaving its web. You see, the Cimbri and Teutons had spent days positioning their massive wagon trains around the edges of that plain. Now, these weren't just supply wagons. They were something far more sinister. Picture rolling fortresses, heavy wooden barriers that could be moved into position to seal off escape routes. As the Romans marched deeper into the plain, those innocent-looking wagon trains began to move slowly, almost imperceptibly, until they formed an enormous circle around the advancing legions. By the time the Romans realized what was happening, it was too late. The retreat they thought they were pursuing had turned into an encirclement. Those scattered barbarian warriors suddenly multiplied, pouring out from behind the wagons, from hidden positions along the riverbank, from every direction at once. The hunters had become the hunted. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. Those wagon barricades weren't just defensive positions, they were weapons. The Cimbri had turned their own supply trains into battering rams. Heavy wooden wagons, pulled by teams of oxen, came thundering across the plain like ancient tanks, smashing into the Roman formations with bone-crushing force. Imagine the sound, the screaming of men and animals, the splintering of shields, the terrible crunch of bodies being crushed under iron-bound wheels. The Roman legions, masters of disciplined warfare, found themselves facing something they had never trained for. Their tight formations, their coordinated maneuvers, their tactical superiority. None of it mattered when wagons the size of houses were plowing through their ranks like ships through water. And through it all, Maximus and Caepio were still not cooperating. Even as their armies were being systematically destroyed, even as thousands of their men were falling, they couldn't put aside their petty rivalry long enough to mount a coordinated defense. It was like watching two fire brigades argue about jurisdiction while Rome burned around them. The slaughter lasted from dawn until dusk. By sunset, the green fields around the Rhône had been turned into a crimson marsh. 80,000 Roman legionaries lay dead or dying. The auxiliary troops, the camp followers, the servants and suppliers, another 40,000 souls added to the toll. It was carnage on a scale that Rome had not seen since Hannibal's darkest victories. But here's the detail that will make your blood run cold. The barbarians didn't just defeat the Romans, they utterly desecrated them. After the battle, the Cimbri and Teutons gathered the bodies of the fallen Romans and hurled them into the Rhône River as offerings to their gods. Imagine it. Tens of thousands of corpses floating downstream, the water running red for miles, the river itself becoming a funeral pyre for Roman ambition. Now, I have to ask you something. Did you know that after this massacre, the barbarians threw Roman bodies into the Rhône as divine offerings? If that shocking detail made you pause, hit that like button right now, share this incredible story with a friend who loves history, and drop a comment below. If you had been there, would you have trusted Caepio or Maximus to lead you into battle? Because honestly, after learning about their rivalry, I'm not sure either choice would have saved those brave legionaries from their fate. The Battle of Arausio was over, but its consequences were just beginning. Rome stood naked before her enemies, her armies destroyed, her generals dead or fled. The road to the capital lay open, and the barbarian tide was about to crash against the very gates of the eternal city. When the dust settled and the survivors limped back to Rome with news of the catastrophe, the Republic faced a moment of reckoning that would shake it to its very foundations. The numbers were so staggering that many Romans simply refused to believe them at first. 120,000 dead. Let me repeat that. 120,000 Roman lives snuffed out in a single day. To put this in perspective, this was worse than Cannae. Yes, worse than Hannibal's masterpiece of military destruction that had haunted Roman nightmares for over a century. Cannae had cost Rome around 70,000 casualties, and that defeat had brought the Republic to its knees. But Arausio? Arausio was Cannae multiplied by horror. The streets of Rome fell silent when the news arrived. Mothers collapsed in their doorways, knowing their sons would never return. Fathers stared at empty chairs where their boys used to sit. Entire families were wiped out. Not just the soldiers, but the camp followers, the merchants, the craftsmen, the slaves who had followed the armies. These weren't just military casualties, they were civilians, families, entire communities that had been swept up in the Roman war machine and ground to dust by barbarian fury. But here's what made it even more terrifying for the average Roman citizen. The barbarians were still out there. The Cimbri and Teutons hadn't disappeared after their victory. They were still moving south, still hungry, still driven by that desperate need for land and survival. And now they knew something that no barbarian tribe had known for generations. Roman legions could be beaten. Roman eagles could be captured. Roman blood could be spilled. Panic gripped the city like a plague. People began hoarding food, hiding their valuables, planning escape routes. The wealthy started quietly moving their assets out of the city. The Senate met in emergency sessions, but what could they do? Their armies were destroyed. Their best generals were dead. And the barbarians were practically at the gates. But sometimes, my friends, sometimes catastrophe breeds greatness. And from the ashes of Arausio rose a man who would transform Rome forever, Gaius Marius. Now, Marius was another one of those new men, like Maximus, a commoner who had risen through talent rather than birth. But unlike Maximus, Marius had something special. He understood that Rome's military system was broken, and he had the vision and the will to fix it. The Marian reforms, as they came to be known, completely revolutionized the Roman military. Gone were the old citizen soldiers who served for a season and then went back to their farms. Marius created professional legions, career soldiers who lived and breathed warfare, who trained constantly, who were equipped and supplied by the state. These new legions were faster, more flexible, more deadly than anything Rome had ever fielded. But here's the twist that makes history so beautifully ironic. The disaster at Arausio, which nearly destroyed Rome, actually made it stronger. The Marian legions that emerged from the ashes of that defeat would go on to conquer Gaul, invade Britain, and expand Roman power to its greatest extent. Sometimes you have to break something completely before you can rebuild it better than it ever was. And speaking of poetic justice, let me tell you about the fate of Quintus Servilius Caepio, our arrogant aristocrat whose pride had cost so many lives. Remember how he refused to cooperate with Maximus? How he looked down on commoners and believed his noble blood made him superior? Well, the universe has a way of serving up cosmic justice with a side of bitter irony. Caepio was captured during the battle. This man who had spent his life believing he was born to rule, who had treated common soldiers like dirt beneath his feet, found himself in chains, sold into slavery by the very barbarians he had dismissed as inferior. Can you imagine the humiliation? The former proconsul of Rome, descendant of ancient nobility, spending his final days as a barbarian's property, probably hauling water or mucking out stables. But here's the part that really drives home the karmic nature of his fate. He died in slavery, forgotten, unmourned, his noble bloodline ending not in glory, but in the most ignoble way possible for a Roman, as someone else's property. The man who had been too proud to take orders from a fellow Roman ended his days taking orders from barbarian masters. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Marius was building the military machine that would make the Republic unstoppable. The Germanic tribes would eventually face these new professional legions, and the results would be very different from Arausio. But that's a story for another day. The Battle of Arausio had taught Rome a lesson written in blood and carved in stone. Pride goes before the fall, but from the ashes of that fall, something greater can rise. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding defeat, but from learning how to transform disaster into opportunity. And so we come to the end of our journey through one of history's most devastating and transformative battles. But before we part ways, I want you to think about something that goes far beyond ancient Rome, far beyond barbarian invasions and fallen legions. Arausio wasn't just a military defeat. It was a mirror held up to every society, every organization, every nation that has ever existed. Look closely at that reflection, and you'll see a truth as sharp as a gladius and twice as cutting. Internal division plus arrogance equals self-destruction. It's a formula as reliable as mathematics and as deadly as poison. Think about it. Rome had everything they needed to crush the Cimbri and Teutons. They had superior numbers, better equipment, more experienced soldiers, tactical knowledge accumulated over centuries of conquest. They had every advantage except the most important one, unity of purpose. Instead of facing their enemy as one people with one mission, they allowed petty rivalries and class prejudices to tear them apart from within. Maximus and Caepio weren't just two feuding generals. They were symbols of a society so obsessed with its own internal hierarchies that it forgot about the external threats gathering at its borders. They were so busy measuring who had the bigger ego that they never bothered to measure the size of the danger approaching them. Now, here's where this ancient story becomes uncomfortably modern. How many battles of Arausio are we fighting right now in our own time? How often do we see organizations, communities, even entire nations tearing themselves apart over internal squabbles while real challenges go unaddressed? How many times have you watched teams fail, not because they lacked talent, but because they couldn't work together? How many opportunities have been lost because people were more interested in being right than being effective? The barbarians at our gates today might not carry spears and shields, but they're just as real and just as dangerous. Climate change, economic inequality, technological disruption, global pandemics, these are the Cimbri and Teutons of our era. And too often, we respond to them the way Rome responded in 105 before Christ, divided, distracted, and ultimately defeated by our own inability to see beyond our tribal loyalties and personal ambitions. But remember, and this is crucial, the story of Arausio doesn't end with defeat. It ends with transformation. Rome learned from its catastrophe. It adapted, reformed, and became stronger than ever. The Marian legions that rose from the ashes of that terrible day would go on to build an empire that lasted for centuries. The question is, will we learn from our modern battles of Arausio before it's too late? Will we recognize that our greatest enemies are often not the ones charging at us from across the battlefield, but the pride, prejudice, and petty divisions that we carry within our own ranks? History doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. And the rhyme scheme of Arausio is still being written in our headlines, our boardrooms, our political chambers, and yes, even in our own daily interactions. Every time we choose ego over cooperation, every time we let perfect be the enemy of good, every time we refuse to work with someone because they're not from our tribe or our class or our background, we're channeling the spirits of Maximus and Caepio, and we're setting ourselves up for our own version of that bloody field by the Rhône. So here's my challenge to you. If this story has made you think, if it sparked something in your mind about the battles we're fighting in our own time, drop a comment below and tell me what lesson you're taking from the Battle of Arausio. Are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, or can we learn to be better than our predecessors? If you've made it this far through this epic tale of pride, prejudice, and ultimate redemption, you're clearly someone who appreciates the deep lessons that history has to offer. Don't let this be the end of our journey together. Subscribe to Imperium Chronicles right now, because every single week we're diving into another incredible chapter from the rise and fall of Rome. From triumphant victories to crushing defeats, from brilliant strategies to catastrophic blunders, we're exploring the stories that shaped our world and continue to shape us today. The legions may have fallen at Arausio, but their story lives on. The question is, what story will we write with our own lives? Will we be remembered as the ones who learned from history, or as the ones who were doomed to repeat it? The choice, as always, is ours to make.